seemed almost like fate was playing a cruel joke on Maigret. After years of being the one asking the questions, here he was, just months into his retirement, sitting under a detective's scrutinizing gaze, being grilled over the details of an ordinary evening. "Are you absolutely certain it was 6:30? Could it have been earlier? And you were beside the fire, you say?" Only now did Maigret truly grasp how unsettling such simple questions could be. A handful of ordinary people, just 6 in this case, were about to find themselves trapped in a moment they hadn't realized was significant until now. And it wasn't even an eventful evening. No dramatic commotions, no cries in the night, just a dreary, rain-soaked November evening in a small, lifeless boarding house. People sitting around, waiting for dinner, listening to the wind howl outside. And yet, when the question came, "Where were you between 6 and 7?" Maigret hesitated, like a schoolboy caught off guard, like a liar scrambling for details. The storm had been raging all day. At the Gare Saint-Lazare, travelers were warned. Severe weather in the Channel, delays expected on the Dieppe-New Haven crossing. Many English passengers turned on their heels and booked another night in Paris rather than battle the elements. In Dieppe, the wind ripped through the streets, slamming doors, rattling signs, and sending sheets of rain hammering down like ocean waves crashing against the shore. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky was dark enough that lights had to be turned on. The ferry, meant to depart at 2, remained docked alongside fishing boats, swaying violently in the storm. Madame Maigret, practical as ever, had resigned herself to the situation, settling in by the stove with her knitting. A ginger cat, belonging to the boarding house, had made itself comfortable in her lap. Occasionally she would glance up at Maigret, who was pacing aimlessly, looking as restless as a man with nowhere to be and nothing to do. "We should have just stayed at a hotel," she murmured. "At least you'd have found someone to play cards with." She was right, of course, but she had insisted on staying here, a place she'd heard about from some acquaintance, a cheaper alternative tucked away at the far end of the quay. Now they were stuck in a lifeless part of town where the summer crowds had long vanished, leaving behind shuttered windows and locked doors. Some vacation this was turning out to be, their first real trip since their honeymoon. Maigret was finally free. No more late-night calls, no more crime scenes. So he had agreed. They would spend 2 weeks in London, a city Madame Maigret had always wanted to see. He even looked forward to visiting a few colleagues at Scotland Yard. But now? Now they were stranded. The storm had ruined their plans, the ferry was delayed, and they were stuck in this dreary second-rate boarding house, its very walls exuding a sense of stingy gloom. Their hostess, Mademoiselle Otard, was a woman in her 50s who tried to conceal her perpetual sourness behind forced smiles. Her nose twitched whenever she caught a whiff of Maigret's pipe smoke trailing through the stuffy rooms. More than once she seemed ready to scold him for smoking indoors, but each time Maigret simply met her gaze with such calm defiance that she thought better of it. She was just as displeased when she caught him poking at the fire, tending to the coals with far too much enthusiasm, making the chimney roar like a furnace. The boarding house itself was small, a narrow 2-story villa with dimly lit hallways. The front sitting room had greenish velvet chairs that had seen better days, and a pile of tattered old magazines no one wanted to read. The dining room was open to guests outside of meal hours, but there was little comfort to be found there either. Madame Maigret remained in the lounge, while Maigret, restless as ever, drifted from room to room. The kitchen was ruled by Mademoiselle Otard and her 2 maids. Jeanne, a slovenly woman in her late 20s with an air of permanent resentment, and Irma, a quiet 15-year-old who spent the afternoon polishing silverware. Then there was the little boy, Jen's son, who was constantly underfoot, scolded more than spoken to. Time crawled. The air in the house was thick with boredom. The black marble clock on the mantel barely seemed to move. "Try to catch a break in the storm and head to the café," Madame Maigret suggested. "You'll find someone to play a game with." Maybe she was right, but even the thought of going out in the rain felt like too much trouble. Mademoiselle Otard bustled in and out of rooms, always suspicious, as if she expected guests to steal old magazines or set fire to the sideboard the moment she turned her back. The sad lady, as the Maigrets privately called her, sat stiffly by the stove in the dining room, engrossed in a book missing its cover. She had been here for weeks. She seemed frail, possibly recovering from an illness, and she moved as though she might break. She sighed through every meal, as though eating was an inconvenience. Then there was the young bride, as Maigret jokingly called her. Though she was neither young nor particularly charming, she was in her 40s, short, plump, and bossy. Her husband, who was at least a decade younger, rushed to her side at the slightest beckon, already wearing the defeated look of a man who had married for security rather than love. By late afternoon, the monotony was broken only by the arrival of Mr. John, a young Englishman who burst through the door, dripping wet, flushed with excitement. "The boat's going to sail," he announced in a thick accent. He had been restless all day, eager to return to England. Now he hurried to settle his bill and tip the maid. Maigret considered making a dash for the Brasserie de Suisses, where at least there'd be noise and conversation. He even reached for his coat, but changed his mind. Instead, he sank into an armchair, flipping through a magazine on agriculture, and, absurdly, found himself engrossed in an article about field mice. The house was quiet again. Madame Maigret counted stitches in her knitting. Irma clinked silverware as she set the table. A faint smell of frying fish drifted in from the kitchen. Then, suddenly, voices. Loud, urgent voices carried by the wind, growing closer, reaching the door. The bell rang violently. Even then Maigret didn't react at first. He had been craving some kind of break in the monotony. Now it had come, but it took a moment for him to set aside his article on field mice. Mademoiselle Otard's voice cut through the commotion. "Yes, this is the house." She opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air and a cluster of people, red-faced, breathless, damp with rain. A uniformed officer stood among them. Beside him, a small man with a cigar clenched between his teeth. "This is where a certain Jean Fenard worked?" the man asked. Maigret spotted the little boy, Jean's son, lurking near the kitchen door, his eyes wide. "She was just shot dead in the Rue de la Digue," the man continued. Mademoiselle Otard blinked, her expression tight with disbelief. She wasn't one to be fooled easily. "Really?" she sniffed, but the man was already pulling a badge from his coat. "I'm with the police. I need you to come with me to identify the body. No one else is to leave the house." Maigret's eyes glimmered with amusement. His wife shot him a knowing look, as if to say, "Why not just tell them who you are?" But Maigret, freshly retired, was relishing his anonymity. He leaned back comfortably, studying the inspector with a keen eye. "Put on your coat. Let's go." "Go where?" Mademoiselle Otard protested. "The morgue." A sharp gasp. Then wails, real or exaggerated, filled the room. The visiting lady moaned, forgotten in the commotion. Irma, the maid, rushed in with a plate in hand. "Is Jenny dead?" "That's none of your concern," Mademoiselle Otard snapped. "Get dinner ready." She turned to the little boy wandering about, clueless. "Put him to bed." Jules Mausolet, in his absurd red slippers, had appeared near the hall. "What's going on?" The inspector, in no mood to explain, muttered something to a uniformed officer who promptly made himself at home by the fire. Meanwhile, Mademoiselle Otard was hurried out in a yellow raincoat and boots, shouting back at Irma, "The fish will burn!" Dinner carried on, though the atmosphere was thick with unease. Mademoiselle, unfazed, merely wondered aloud, could it have been a gang killing? Maigret ate heartily, while his wife observed him in disbelief. How could he be so detached, having spent his life solving crimes? The sad lady barely touched her food, sighing between each breath. The policeman, perched backward on a chair, relished his moment. "I found her," he declared. "How?" Mademoiselle leaned in, the most intrigued of all. "By accident. I live near the harbor, where no one really goes. I was walking, saw something dark on the ground. At first I thought it was just another drunk. Even in winter, especially in winter. People drink to stay warm," Jules Mausolé chuckled. "And in summer they drink to cool down?" "Exactly." The officer poured himself a glass of wine, then helped himself to the last 2 pieces of fish. "She was a wild one, that girl, always at the dance hall near the docks. Must have been a crime of passion." Mademoiselle nodded, as if that somehow made it less tragic. At that moment Mademoiselle Otare returned, wind-whipped and pale. She carried herself with an air of importance, silently daring someone to ask what she knew. Scanning the plates on the table, she barked at Irma, "Why haven't you served the veal yet?" Then, turning to the officer, "Your chief will be here soon. He's calling New Haven." Maigret stiffened. Mademoiselle Otard caught it, her gaze sharpening. "At least, that's what I assume," she added, though. It was clear she knew more than she let on. The inspector straightened. "I'll need to question everyone." Mademoiselle Otard took charge. "We'll shut the doors. You can use the lounge." One by one, they were called in. Madame Maigret was first. Through the closed door her voice carried. "Yes, Maigret," like the detective. "You're not related, are you?" "I'm his wife." Silence, then an awkward chuckle. A moment later Maigret himself was summoned. The inspector, now sheepish, muttered, "You could have told me who you were." Maigret shrugged. "Just following protocol, aren't we?" But as the questioning continued, something gnawed at Maigret. Everyone had been in and out that day. The house was a sieve of movements and half-truths. Irma, nervous, admitted Jean had been anxious. She wanted out of this place. Said it this morning. Madame Mausolé confessed she had followed her husband, suspicious of his wanderings, only to lose track of him. "I thought I was following him," she muttered, "but somehow I lost him." Maigret listened, arms folded, pipe between his teeth. A puzzle was forming, fragmented, unclear, but beginning to take shape. "Don't you get it? By the time I grabbed my coat and opened my umbrella, he was already at the corner." I rushed to catch up, but when I finally spotted a figure in a brown raincoat under the streetlights, I realized it wasn't Jules. So I turned back, pretending nothing had happened. "How long before he came home?" "I don't know. I was upstairs. He might have lingered downstairs for a bit." Just then the doorbell rang. A uniformed officer handed a note to the inspector, who skimmed it and passed it to Maigret. No one named John Miller, matching the description, disembarked from the Dieppe boat at New Haven. The inspector invited Maigret to tag along on his investigation, though without much enthusiasm. As they walked, dodging broken roof tiles scattered on the pavement, he muttered, "Something's off about this John Miller. The landlady says he's been staying at her place for days, but always dodges questions. Paid his bill in small French coins. Barely went out and only in the mornings. Mademoiselle Otard saw him in the market pretending to be interested in butter and eggs." "Or maybe in the housewives' purses," Maigret quipped. "You think he's a pickpocket?" "Would explain how he slipped into England under a different name." They headed to Victor's Café near the fish market. Inside, the floor was slick with grease, the air thick with smoke, and a jukebox blasted tinny music. The inspector caught the eye of a waitress and tugged her apron. "What time did Jeannie come in today?" "Jeannie?" She hesitated, glanced at a group of men, then shrugged. "Didn't see her. She comes often, though?" "Sometimes. She peeks in, and if he's here, he steps outside." "You mean Gustav?" "You'll have to ask Bert. I was out." Bert, the other waitress, squinted suspiciously. "Ask him yourself. I'm not the police." By now, word had spread. A red-hammed man in rubber boots, trousers held up with strings, spat on the floor and stepped forward, revealing a jagged, broken tooth. "Me you're talking about? Did you see Jean tonight?" "What's it to you?" "She's dead." The man's face dropped. "No way." He turned to the others. "Is this true? Jean's dead?" "Answer the question. Did you see her?" "Yes, she came." "What time?" "Not sure. After 5, I guess. I was playing cards with Big Joe." "Did she come inside?" "I don't let her. She peeked in. I went outside, told her to leave me alone." "Why?" "Because." The cafe had gone silent. The jukebox was off. Everyone listened. "You two fighting?" He shrugged. "Kinda, yeah. Explain." "She was jealous." "I was into someone else. Some girl who came to the dance hall once with Jeannie." "Who?" "I don't even know her name. Works at the boarding house. That's all. Jeannie showed up. I told her to back off or I'd hit her." "And after that?" "I watched the New Haven boat leave. Thought it might struggle in the current." He smirked. "You gonna arrest me?" "Not yet. Go ahead. We're used to taking the fall for others." "Did Jean suffer?" Maigret stood back, watching. He wasn't used to being a bystander. He had to bite his tongue not to jump in. "Coming?" the inspector asked, dropping coins on the table. "Where?" "Station." "I'll write my report, then call it a night." Outside, he murmured, "I'll put a man on Broken Tooth. That's my way. No rushing. Just watching." Maigret left him at the station and wandered. He killed time at a brasserie, watching a dull backgammon game. His shoes were soaked, a cold creeping in. He ordered a hot toddy that sent warmth through his chest. None of this was his problem anymore. He had waited years for retirement. No point in complaining now. Still, his feet carried him to the end of the quay where a violet glow reflected on wet pavement. A dance hall. He hadn't planned on going in, but there he was, stepping through the garish doorway. Inside, 2 women danced, the band playing just for them. The bartender poured his drink from a suspicious-looking kettle. "You just passing through?" "Yeah." "Then let me save you some trouble. The girls here dance, they drink, but that's it, especially tonight." "Why tonight?" The man gestured toward the dancing women. "They're just trying to shake off bad news. One was crying earlier, found out a friend of theirs got killed." "Oh, un accident, a murder. A servant girl shot in the street, not even 100 meters from here." Maigret exhaled. He hadn't even thought to ask if Jean was shot in the head or chest. The bartender leaned in. "It wasn't a loco. The men here? They brawl. Fists, knives maybe, but a gun? No. That was an outsider." He poured himself a drink. "Ever since I heard, I haven't felt right." "Would you like an introduction?" Maigret hesitated just a second too long. The bartender was already waving over the 2 girls. "This gentleman over here is feeling a bit lonely and wants to buy you a drink. Come on over. It's more comfortable in this corner." He gave Maigret a wink, as if granting permission for some harmless fun. "What can I get you? A hot toddy?" "That'll do." It felt awkward. Maigret wasn't sure how to handle the situation. The 2 women watched him curiously, attempting small talk. "Care for a dance?" "I don't dance." "We could teach you." "No way." That was where he drew the line. The idea of gliding across the floor under the gaze of the three-piece band was too much. "Are you a salesman?" "Yes, just passing through. The boss mentioned something about a tragedy." "She wasn't a friend of ours," one of the girls said quickly. "Oh," I thought. "If she was, we wouldn't be here tonight. We knew her, sure. Like we know most girls who come through. But now that she's gone, there's no point in speaking ill of her. It's already sad enough." "Of course," Maigret nodded. His job now was to wait, stay patient, and not spook them. "Was she respectable?" he asked finally. "That's putting it mildly." Marie Danche. A few more patrons wandered in. One of the women danced with a stranger. Then Maigret spotted Gustave Brokentooth, completely drunk, slumped against the bar. For a moment the man stared at him as if trying to recognize him. Maigret braced for a scene, but nothing came of it. Too drunk to see straight. The bar owner, meanwhile, had made it clear introducing Maigret to local company came with an expectation, a round of drinks every 15 minutes. By the time Maigret stumbled out at 1 in the morning, he struggled with his coat buttons and stepped into every puddle. Back at the boarding house, he forgot about the special bell for late arrivals and rang the main door loudly, waking the whole house. Mademoiselle Otard answered, unimpressed, a coat thrown over her nightgown. "Tonight of all nights," she muttered. Upstairs, Madame Maigret turned on the light as he entered, her face full of quiet curiosity as he fumbled with his collar. "Where have you been?" she murmured, turning toward the wall. Maigret repeated her words with a strange smile. "Where have I been? Suppose I told you? Villecontour?" She frowned, searching her memory. "Where's that?" "In the Cher, Villecontour." She let it go, deciding questions could wait until morning. Madame Maigret had a habit of rising at dawn, no matter where she was. Even on mornings when there was nothing to do, she couldn't stay in bed. "I always feel like I have housework waiting," she'd told him just the day before. So before daylight, Maigret stirred to the glow of the electric light and the soft sound of water splashing as she washed up. His head ached. What was that name? The one he'd thrown out last night? It had been stuck in his mind so long, now it was gone. He dozed lightly, aware of small details, the lamp switching off, the dim light of dawn, footsteps on the stairs, the front doorbell ringing twice. He wondered if it was still raining, but couldn't summon the energy to ask. Then a shake on the shoulder. "The local police inspector is here," his wife said. Maigret groaned. "What's that got to do with me?" "He's asking for you." She handed him coffee with a knowing look. He must have had one toddy too many last night. Dressing was a chore, and he almost skipped shaving. "What was the name I told you last night?" he asked as he got ready. "What name?" "The village." "Oh, something in the Cantal?" "No, in the chair." "Are you sure?" "I think it ended in on." She didn't remember either. No use worrying. Downstairs the entire house was gathered in silence, stiff as statues. Mademoiselle Otard shot him a look, probably for waking everyone last night. The Mousselis weren't speaking, a sure sign of a morning argument. Even little Irma looked sour. "Good morning," Maigret greeted them. No one responded. Then the lounge door opened, and the police inspector, looking far too pleased with himself, ushered him inside. "I had a feeling I'd find you still in bed," he said with a smirk. Maigret sighed, poking the fire. He already knew what this was about. "Your Gustave Brokentooth was there last night, wasn't he?" The inspector raised a hand. "I wasn't going to bring it up." Idiot. He thought Maigret had been at the dance hall for fun. "I wanted to speak with you because of something unexpected." Maigret stared out the window at the wind-swept quay, barely listening. "The Dieppe police found something. Did you notice anything unusual on your way down?" "You mean all the people gathered in the dining room?" "Yes." I wanted them all in one place before we go further. The reason? The person who killed Jean Fenard is one of them." Maigret remained unfazed, barely lifting an eyebrow. What actually bothered him was that stupid village name, still evading him. The inspector pulled out a damp gray menu card, the kind used at the boarding house. The ink was smudged, but Maigret could still make out sorrel soup, mackerel with mustard sauce. "That's the menu from 2 nights ago," he said. "Exactly. And it was found this morning just a few meters from where Jeannie was killed. I know you noticed last night I didn't rush to arrest. Broken tooth despite his record. This is why. The killer is staying in this house," Maigret exhaled, lighting his second pipe. "And the numbers written on the back?" The inspector hesitated. 79x140. Below that, 160x80. I thought maybe a game score. But it's not times or locations either. No idea yet. But I do know the killer is here." The inspector's excitement was almost theatrical. "Did you notice anyone writing on a menu that night?" "No," Maigret said, dragging on his pipe. "Nothing like that. I think we should begin questioning them now," the inspector said eagerly. "Not until I've had something to drink," Maigret muttered, stepping into the next room, where his wife sat patiently among the rest. In the dim light, the room felt like a small-town waiting area, stale, quiet, and thick with unspoken tension. Behind the half-drawn curtains, a handful of people sat stiffly, exchanging wary glances but avoiding eye contact. Madame Maigret could have easily skipped this, but she wasn't the type to take special treatment. She preferred to blend in, knitting in hand, silently counting stitches, as if it were just another ordinary evening. The inspector brought her in first, out of courtesy, apologizing for the trouble and handing her a menu without any tricks or pressure. "Does this look familiar?" he asked. Madame Maigret glanced at her husband, then back at the menu, hesitating before finally shaking her head. "No, nothing," she said. "Did you notice anyone writing on a menu the other night?" "I was too busy knitting," she admitted, though her quick glance at her husband suggested there was more she wanted to say. He picked up on it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated, nervous about making a mistake. Blushing, she mumbled, "Maybe I'm wrong, but these numbers look like fabric measurements. 79 centimeters, just about what you'd need for a skirt, and 1 meter 40. That's a common fabric width." Her confidence grew as she saw a flicker of interest in Maigret's eyes. "If the fabric was narrower, say 80 centimeters, you'd need twice the length. I don't know if this matters, but..." Maigret sighed, both amused and impressed by her humility. Then a sudden thought struck her. "That name, could it have ended in Ard?" She frowned, still chasing a memory. Mademoiselle Otard, the boarding-house owner, was unimpressed when questioned. "Yes, that's my menu, but I didn't write those numbers," she said curtly. She had little patience for the ongoing investigation. "If my house is going to be treated like a crime scene, Forgive me, mademoiselle," the inspector interrupted, deliberately correcting himself after calling her madam. "We have reason to believe the killer is here in this very house." "Who?" she scoffed. "I intend to find out." He pressed her on Jean Fenard, the young maid who had been in her service. "How long was she here?" 6 months, Otard replied tersely. "Where did you find her?" "Like anyone else. Through the door." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Did you come through an agency?" "No." "She approached you directly?" "Yes." "Had you met her before?" "I had." "Where?" "At home." "At home." "She worked at the Anardar, where I was a cashier." "In Villecomtois?" "Yes." Maigret fought to keep his expression neutral. That was it, the key location, Villecomtois, a place that until now had meant nothing to him. Then came Jules Mousselet, lounging with a cigarette and an air of indifference. "Still at it?" he said with a smirk. "Did you write these numbers?" Maigret asked, holding up the menu. "Why would I be scribbling on menus? Not the menu itself. The notes on the back." Mousselet turned it over in his hands. "Nope, not me." "Did you know Jean?" He hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I mean before you came here. I'd seen her before." "In Dieppe?" "No, at home." There it was again, that name, Villecomtois. Maigret leaned forward. "You're from Villecomtois?" "Yes." "And Jeanne worked there?" "She was the maid at the Aunelle d'Or." "Just like Mademoiselle Otard?" Mousselet nodded. "When my wife and I came through Dieppe, we figured we'd stay with someone from our hometown." Maigret smiled to himself. It was all coming together. Almost everyone tied to this case had roots in that one remote village. Then it was Madame Mousselet's turn. She entered with a composed, almost defiant posture. "What now?" "You live in Villecomtois?" "Yes." "My father owned the Anneau d'Or Hotel before he passed." "Where did you buy your trousseau?" She blinked. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just curious." "In Paris." "Ah, so you plan to finish your honeymoon there?" "We were supposed to start there, but we wanted to see the sea first." "Convenient," Maigret mused. "You're a size 12, I'd guess?" "A large 12. But I have to hem my dresses." "You don't sew them yourself?" "I have a seamstress." He nodded, puffing on his pipe. "How much fabric would you need?" "For a skirt?" She frowned. 79 centimeters or so exactly," Maigret murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to the inspector. "These notes on the menu card prove none of the women are guilty." The inspector frowned. "What do you mean?" "A woman knows her own measurements. She wouldn't need to write them down. But if a man was trying to buy her a surprise gift," he gestured toward an old-fashioned magazine on the table, "I'd bet money that one of these patterns caught Madame Mousselet's eye, and her husband jotted down the details to buy fabric later. He's got good reason to keep her happy. After all, she owns the money. He was the convenient choice for a husband." The inspector's eyes widened. "So, Jeanne?" "She and Mousselet had history. She knew things about him. Saw him show up here, newly married, rolling in his wife's money. And what does she do? Blackmails him," the inspector murmured. "Exactly. And Mousselet, terrified of losing his cushy setup, panicked." A beat of silence. Then Maigret strode into the dining room, locking eyes with Mousselet. "Come here," he said, voice low but firm. Mousselet flinched. "What?" "You heard me." As the policeman followed, Maigret gave his colleague a look that said, "You know how to handle men like him." Behind the closed door, voices rose, protests, then a heavy thud. Outside, Maigret stood by the window, watching rain streak down the glass, thinking about the next boat to New Haven. Then a tap on his shoulder. "It's done," the inspector said. "He confessed." Maigret didn't turn, just smiled to himself. Sometimes it's best not to seem too clever.